The Beatles' first full-length album is Please Please Me, and as I mentioned in the last video, was released in March of 1963. Let's take just a minute to go back to what I was talking about, the difference between the UK and the US versions. There's a story I'll get into in more detail next week about why Capitol Records in the United States was not willing to release Beatles music. Capitol Records is actually the subsidiary label of EMI in the United States. So this was a subsidiary label telling the parent company, we don't want to release the music. Anyway, more involved story, but the bottom line is they didn't want to release the Beatles music, so George Martin still wanted it released in this country. And so he released a lot of the early music before 1964, throughout 1963, on VJ Records, and then another single on Swan Records. And so VJ had the tapes for Please Please Me and some of the singles surrounding it. They brought out an album called Introducing the Beatles, which is essentially Please Please Me without the song Please Please Me or Ask Me Why. It was originally scheduled to be released in the summer of 1963, but for whatever reason it wasn't. But when the Beatles started to have the hit with I Want to Hold Your Hand in January of 1964, VJ rushed the album out and had a hit record on their hands. The Beatles had a hit record on their hands with VJ. In fact, at one point they had, two of their own albums at the top of the charts on different labels. Meet the Beatles, which was the U.S. version of With the Beatles. Was on Capitol, and this one, Introducing the Beatles, on VJ. And so the reason why the two tracks were cut off it is a little bit like the way Capitol did. The original album had 14 tracks on it, and VJ said, that's too much. We only do six tracks aside in this country, so they cut two tunes off, so Please Please Me and Ask Me Why were, of course, available as singles A and B side. So there's a quick comparison between the US and the UK version. We're talking about the UK version here. On the UK version, there are 6 covers out of 14 songs on the album. And people knowing the history of the Beatles say, oh gosh, that's odd that there are as many as 6 covers on the album. No, that's not what's odd about this record. What's odd about this record is that there are 8 originals on the record. Most other groups would have maybe gotten 1 or 2 songs on the record, but almost everything they did would have been covers. What's exceptional here is the Beatles have got so much of their original music on the very first album. But the 6 covers tell us a little bit more, as we were talking before, about some of the influences on the Beatles' music. We have Anna, sung by John, which was a song that had originally been done by Arthur Alexander. We have Chains, a girl group song that had been a number 17 hit for the Cookies. That one sung by George. Boys, another Shirelles girl group song. In fact, it was the B-side of Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow. That's a song for Ringo to sing. Baby It's You, another Shirelles girl group song, a number 8 song. That one sung by John. A Taste of Honey, which was a Bobby Scott tune from a soundtrack that Paul sings, and Twist and Shout by the Isley Brothers, sung by John famously at the end of the session. That became a number 17 hit after the Beatles' success, but famously sung at the end of the session because John was going to scream it, and they knew after he sang Twist and Shout there'd be nothing left. Of course, you're doing the album all in a day. There was no chance of coming back the next day. So they kept that one for the end, and as a lot of commentators like to say, you could almost hear the vocal cords shredding as he's singing that tune. Very, very energetic. Look at how many girl group songs we have. When you look at the early imaging of the Beatles, one of the things that Brian Epstein did is he got the Beatles out of all the kind of leather gear and into matching suits, the Beatle boots, the haircuts, all that kind of thing. He really spiffed up the act. And when they're presented live on stage, you see that the lead singer is always at one mic and the 2 background vocalists are at another mic. That looks very much like the way the girl groups were imaged at about the same time. So Brian Epstein taking his cue from what was happening. So in many ways, I guess we should look for girl group influence in the music of the Beatles, which is not the way most people tend to think about that music, but it's very much a part of who they were early on. The 8 songs here that are originals are A mostly Paul song, I Saw Her Standing There, we'll talk about that in the next video. A mostly John song called Misery, another mostly John song called Ask Me Why, a John song called Please Please Me, which we'll talk about in just the next video, and a mostly Paul song called Love Me Do, which we'll talk about in the next video. In addition to that, there's P.S. I Love You, mostly written by Paul. Do You Want to Know a Secret? Was written by John for George to sing lead on, and There's a Place, another John song. In most cases, almost all cases, except in the cases where John and Paul have written a song for one of the other Beatles, Ringo or George, to sing. If it's a John song, John sings lead. If it's a Paul song, Paul sings lead. Doesn't always happen that way. There are Paul songs where John sings lead, but most of the time, if they wrote the song, they sing the song and the other guy sings the harmony. What are some of the musical features that we can find that sort of go across all of these songs plus the singles from this era? Well, the songs are short, arranged, and very polished. So in distinction to distinguishing them from, say, early Rolling Stones singles, where there's a kind of rawness that they're actually trying to get into the records because they very much like the music of chess blues and the sort of authenticity of a kind of a rugged performance. And so that's sort of where the Stones are at. The Beatles, more kind of a polished, professional kind of recording kind of thing. The songs are short, as I say, very much arranged, and always falling around the 2 minutes to 2 minutes and 20-second timeline, which is perfect for trying to get your song on the radio, it turns out. Very much vocals up front. So these are not songs that are led by like guitar licks or guitar solos. It's all about the singing. Any guitar solo is short and provided for contrast. I would say George Harrison, one of the masters of the perfect pop guitar solo. They're not fancy. We're not talking Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck or Ritchie Blackmore here, but they're just the right thing to fit in the tune in the context of what the Beatles are doing. A lot of emphasis on harmony singing, especially the two-part vocals between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In many ways influenced by the Everly Brothers. The two-part vocal singing the Everly Brothers did, especially since it's not only two parts, but sort of in a high range. And so lots of singing. These Beatles records are essentially singing records. If you're in a band and you're trying to cover Beatles tunes and you haven't got singers, you are really in trouble because the songs really are about the singing. There's an extensive use of AABA form in this early music, and we'll talk about that in the next video when we talk about some specific songs. But AABA form is a very, very typical formal structure that appears in American Tin Pan Alley music. It's not the only formal structure, but it's very, very common. And so when you see it happening in these early Beatles songs over and over again, probably 90% of the time you're looking at an AABA form, one of these tunes, you know that the Beatles must have been aware of that form. They didn't just keep sort of happening onto it over and over again, like, what do you know, this one's kind of like the other one. No, they knew what they were doing. They knew what the form, what the formula was. And what this does is it gives us an idea that they had studied the music that they were playing when they were doing cover versions. They had figured out in their own language, I'm not saying they were music theorists who understand all the terminology of music theory, but what I'm saying is they understood how these songs were constructed and they imitated that. They modeled their music on that. So in many ways we can say that early Beatles music is essentially American pop or extremely influenced by American pop. It acquires much more Britishness as the Beatles' careers develop, but early on it is an imitation, it's an homage to American popular music, and AABA form is one way in which we can see that play out. It's simple instrumentation, a couple of guitars, bass, vocals, drums, and in many ways the recordings are a kind of audio snapshot. That is, there's no extensive overdubbing or bringing in of sitars or synthesizers or string orchestras, things like that. What you hear is essentially meant to be a snapshot of what you might hear if the group was in front of you playing at that particular moment. And when you compare these recordings on the albums with the BBC recordings, which were in fact done live, they really do sound very much like each other. These really are audio snapshots. I mention that because that's going to change. As we go through the weeks, what we're going to find is that Beatles records increasingly stop being audio snapshots, start to take advantage of the recording studio and the various kinds of things that are possible in a recording studio. And we're going to want to sort of track that change as we track the development of this album. For now, it's audio recordings. Now, in the next video, I want to do what I call song close-ups, which is take a little bit closer look at 3 of the songs we've been talking about from this album: Love Me Do, Please Please Me, and I Saw Her Standing There.